We now take a brief look at deductive arguments. Now, a deductive argument is an argument in which the premises are intended to provide complete support for the conclusion. They are offered as evidence that the conclusion must be true. Now, this is often spoken of in terms of the conclusion not going beyond the premises. And this is sometimes presented as the idea that what's in the conclusion is contained within the premises, and so there's no leap. For example, if we take sort of a standard deductive argument, one of the classics known as modus ponens, also known as affirming the antecedent, it has the form if P then Q, P therefore Q. And let's take a particular example. Let's take if today is Saturday, then tomorrow is Sunday. Premise 2, today is Saturday. Conclusion, tomorrow is Sunday. And as it can be seen, there's no leap going from Sunday follows Saturday, today's Saturday, so tomorrow is Sunday. That ends up, without any leap there, not going beyond the premises. Now, because of this, deductive arguments deal in certainty. So if they do what they're supposed to, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed. Now, in the context of arguing in ethics, deductive arguments are often used as a logical frame to present points established in other, typically inductive arguments. For example, a person might begin by arguing that art that is sexist in its content is harmful to people, and then build an argument, a deductive argument, using that claim, and establish the claim that if sexist art is harmful, it should be censored. Having established the second premise that sexist art is harmful, and draw the conclusion that it should be censored. And so it's common to use deductive arguments, at least in the context of ethics, as more of a frame. Typically, as that sort of argument. You establish one thing, that if, say, something is harmful, it should be prevented or censored or banned. Establish that it is harmful, and conclude that it should be censored or banned. Now, how do you tell whether you've got a good deductive argument or not? Well, there are the following methods. The first one is what's called the analogy method. And the idea is this. Because validity is a structural feature, it's the way the argument is put together. Kind of like a mathematical formula, for example. If you have a formula that's correct, anytime you plug the numbers into it, the correct numbers, you'll get a correct result. So likewise, with a deductive argument, if it's valid, any argument like that, with that same exact form, will be valid. So for example, the classic modus ponens, if P then Q, P therefore Q, will always be a valid argument. So any argument built like that, replacing the P and Q with whatever it is you're talking about, that would be a valid argument. This of course requires that you know the form, and you know that it's a valid form. And to see whether it's invalid or not, you'd have to do so by knowing that it's an invalid form. Now, the second method is the informal method, and this basically involves assuming all the premises are true, and then sort of asking yourself, could that conclusion still be false? For example, if we have premise 1, if today is Saturday, then tomorrow is Sunday, and we have premise 2, today is Saturday, and we look at the conclusion, tomorrow is Sunday, assuming today is Saturday, assuming Saturday follows Sunday, or rather Sunday follows Saturday, then is it possible that today is Saturday, that Sunday follows Saturday, and that tomorrow is not Sunday? And it would seem to follow that, well, no, it's not. So that would seem to be valid. Now this method, of course, is not completely reliable, because an argument may be very complex, and it may not be obvious that the premises guarantee the conclusion. Or a person may be misled. They may simply think, well, sure, that would follow, and then simply be wrong about it. Now, fortunately, there are also very formal methods, truth tables, proofs, Venn diagrams, and these are definite and objective methods of testing arguments for validity. We won't look at these methods in this class because it's an ethics class, as opposed to a critical thinking or logic class. But if you want to learn more about that, The critical thinking class that I teach includes an entire section on deductive logic, looking at Venn diagrams and then truth tables. If you take the logic class, you'll see pretty much all this stuff. You'll see categorical logic, you'll see the proofs, the truth tables, etc. Now, as we saw before in the previous section on argument basics, deductive arguments break into valid and invalid and sound and unsound. So to recap that, a valid deductive argument is such that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And an invalid argument is such that even if all the premises were true, the conclusion could still be false. Now, interestingly or boringly enough, an argument can be valid and contain false stuff. You could have false premises and a false conclusion, or some false premises and some true ones and a false conclusion. The only thing you can't have, of course, is an argument that's valid with all true premises and a false conclusion, because then it wouldn't be valid. It would be invalid. Now, an invalid argument, again, is such that even if all the premises are true, the conclusion could still be false. And again, just as a valid argument could contain false premises and a false conclusion, an invalid argument could contain all stuff that's true, but still be poor reasoning. Now, as we saw before, if an argument actually is valid, it has all true premises, it's sound, because that's what it means to be sound. If it is invalid, it's unsound. If it has one or more false premises, it's unsound. And obviously, if it's invalid and has one or more false premises, it's unsound. So there's only one way to be sound: valid, all true premises. There are three ways to be unsound. It could be invalid, could have one or more false premises, or both, namely invalid plus one or more false premises. Now, there are many common valid deductive arguments. I mentioned the modus ponens. Others include modus tollens, which is premise 1, if P then Q, premise 2, not Q, conclusion, not P. For example, if someone says, if something is the capital of Florida, then it must be in Florida, and someone says, and we know that that some place is not in Florida, then we know that it's not the capital. There are various other types as well: the hypothetical syllogism, the disjunctive syllogism, the dilemma. I included these in the notes, but for practical purposes, on the quizzes and on the exam, those won't be included. Now, if you're interested in looking at some of the common forms, you can take a look at them. You may find them useful in the paper, but you're not actually required to use them or actually even know the forms. You should be aware of the stuff about deductive logic, because it'll come up in the course as well. But for the most part, you could do the paper completely without any deductive arguments at all. Now, I'll close the section on our very, very brief section on deductive arguments with the classic reductio ad absurdum, also known as, in English, reducing to absurdity. Now, the way this argument works, it's got two forms. One way to use the argument is to assume that a claim is true and prove that assuming the claim is true leads to something that is absurd, false, or contradictory. And that would show that the claim P is true is false. So oddly enough, the way the reductio works is one assumes the claim is true, shows this leads to absurdity, and concludes that it must be false. The second approach is the opposite. If you want to prove something is true, you assume that the claim is false. Then you prove this assumption leads to something false, absurd, or contradictory. And you conclude the claim that P is false is itself false. So that becomes, by the magic of double negation, true. For example, suppose someone claims that oppression, the term, is to be best defined as the mistreatment of a minority by a majority. They take that as the definition. Now, consider sexism, which is taken as a form of oppression. In this case, a majority, women, who are 51% of the population, are mistreated by a minority, in this case men, 49%. Therefore, under this definition, sexism would not be oppression. Now this is clearly absurd, so the definition is mistaken. So that's the reductio ad absurdum, presented kind of informally. The more technical version would be more exact, but that's kind of the basic idea. You assume something is true, prove that assumption leads to a contradiction, therefore the claim must be false. Or assume that a claim is false, show this leads to a contradiction, and then infer that it must be true. And once again, the important thing to know out of this part about deductive arguments is know the general definition. Deductive arguments are such that they're intended to provide, such that they're supposed to provide complete support by the premises to the conclusion. That is to say, they're intended to be valid. They're either valid or invalid, sound or unsound. Know the definitions of those. And again, for the particular forms, you don't have to worry about those for practical purposes like the paper or the test. And so concludes our very brief section on deductive argument.